So, as we get into the passage tonight, before we do, I want to ask a question, which is, what would you do if you knew that you were going to die tomorrow? Like, if it was a sure thing, you knew for a fact this was your final night on earth, how would you spend your time? I asked this question in our church this evening, and the answers that we got were kind of varied. Um, Somebody said that they would spend all night praying and just asking the Lord for forgiveness to make sure that they were ready to meet Him. I had somebody else who, there's the obvious answer, like you'd spend time with your family. And for myself, I know that that's my answer. Kelly said that she would probably take out an insurance policy, a life insurance policy, so that there'd be something for those she left behind, namely me, which I'm appreciative of. But I've heard answers before, like I would go skydiving, or I'd go rob a bank. I'd do something thrilling because it's my last night here. There's all sorts of answers to this question. The reason that I ask it is Jesus was kind of unique in history, in that he was one of the few people who knew without a doubt that tomorrow he was going to die. Like, he knew when it was his final night on earth, and he got to choose how he spent his hours of that final night. And he was also in a more unique position in that he had his freedom while knowing it, and he also had perfect health. And of course, Jesus had all sorts of power, so he could have done anything he wanted. And so what I want to do is I want to start today by looking at how Jesus spent those final hours of his last night on earth. We're going to be in John chapter 13. I'm going to skip around a little bit in this message, so I hope that's okay. John 13, verse 1 through 5 is where we'll start. It says this: It was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Or another way that's translated is, he showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. We'll go ahead and stop there. This is not how I would spend my final night. Jesus literally gets down on the ground and begins to wash his disciples' feet. As the final time he has together with them, this is how he spends it. Jesus had always been teaching the disciples about humility and about being the least and taking the place of a servant if you're going to be a leader. And he enacts this on his final night. He shows them the extent of his love. I think there's also symbolism in here about the fact that the Lord purifies us when we're unclean. All of us start out unclean, and he makes us clean. And so the final night, he is making clean those who followed him. Back in this day, all of the roads in Israel and just all over the world in general, they weren't paved with asphalt like ours are. They were just dirt roads, and people wore sandals. And so you would, just as you walked throughout the city, your feet would become muddy and caked in like dirt and everything. And it was just, you'd become very unclean. And so when you came into your house, one of the first things you wanted to do was to wash your feet. Now, this is not something that your master, your rabbi would do for you. This is something that the lowest of servants would do. So Jesus is here with his friends. And that's the first way that I was thinking about this, is the fact that Jesus is with his friends and he's showing his friends his love. But then I began to think about it, and Judas is here also. And so I had this realization. Jesus spent his last night on earth literally washing the feet of his greatest enemy. And there's something that's like so jarring about that. Like, I had suddenly in my mind this image of Jesus knelt down on the ground in front of Judas, and he is down on his face with a water bucket with the soles of his feet in his hand, and he's washing the feet of his the man who's about to kill him. And it just, like, something inside of me was like screaming, like, that's not right. As I was thinking of this mental image of Jesus washing Judas's feet, even knowing that Judas was about to be the one who would go and betray him. So we pick up the rest of this passage in verse 21. It says this: after Jesus had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit, and he testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple, and he said, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It's the one to whom I'll give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. I'm going to stop there. So there's something more happening in this passage that you understand when you understand the fullness of what Jesus has done here. So Jesus has just finished explaining to his disciples the symbolism of the bread and the wine at that last meal. And he said that the bread that he took and he broke it before giving to his disciples, that represents Jesus' broken body. And the wine represents the blood that Jesus was about to shed for all of mankind. Jesus was about to literally go to his death to be able to save the sins of, or save men from their sins. And there's this symbolism here where I think when I see in this passage, Jesus takes the bread in his hand and it represents his broken body, and he dips it into the wine, which is like being covered in blood. And so there's this image of the body covered in blood, and he passes it to Judas. And there's this moment in which Jesus is reaching across the table to Judas, and Judas is reaching across to take the bread. And both of them have their hand on it for an instant. And I want you to pause there with that image in your mind. And Jesus is sitting there as the one who is about to give up his life willingly. And so he has a hand on the broken body, the body covered in the blood. And Judas is the one who's about to destroy the Son of God. He's the one who's about to betray Jesus to his death. And so his hand is also reaching across the table. And for a moment, they're both holding on to this piece of bread soaked in wine. And I want you to have that image in your mind. And I want you to pause it right there. And we're going to rewind now. So with that image stuck in your mind, we're going to rewind 3 years to the very start of Jesus' ministry. I want you to go back, forget everything that's happened, and to go back. There's a day in the very beginning of his ministry in which there's a lightness to this day. There's an easiness to this day. The crowds are there. Everyone's being healed. People are, overjoyed, jumping for joy, praising God. The sun is shining down. It's shining on both the evil in the crowd as well as the good. There's this warmth to this day. The Father is pleased, and he's shining his light on everyone. And this is the first day that the disciples have been called. In fact, this is the first day. This is the day that Judas was called to be a disciple of Jesus. It's in Luke chapter 6. We're told that this is the day that Judas was called. Day 1, Judas with his thief's heart, who will someday betray Jesus and have him killed. Judas, who will probably become the one who hurts Jesus the most of anyone in the world, is sitting among the 12, and all of them are hanging on Jesus' every word. This is the context as Jesus begins to speak. And we're going to pick it up here in Luke chapter 6, verse 27 through 36. It says this: "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Be good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also." Jesus is going to have to stand by these words soon enough, because we know he was struck on the face, and he didn't raise a hand back. He turned to them the other cheek. Jesus goes on to say, "If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Or this is more accurately translated, if someone takes your cloak, do not keep them from taking your tunic. And we know that Jesus, on the night that he was killed, they stripped off of him his cloak, and they took his tunic as well, and Jesus didn't stop them. Jesus goes on to say, give to everyone who asks of you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Jesus is going to have Judas as one of the disciples, and Judas is constantly stealing from the money bag, we're told. He's taking from what Jesus owns and taking it himself, and Jesus never demands it back from Judas. He goes on, do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. The Matthew passage goes on and it says that the Father makes the sun shine on the righteous and the unrighteous, the wicked as well as the good. And he doesn't make any distinction. And so it says to be like your Father in this way. I think the reason Jesus gives us this teaching is because he knows that the only way to halt the progression of evil is by doing good. There is no way that you can do evil when someone does evil to you and in that way stop evil from occurring, right? It just literally makes no sense. It's like darkness. Darkness is halted only by light, right? If you want there to be no darkness, you flip on a light. There's no such thing as stopping darkness by compounding the darkness, by adding darkness to dark. That's not a thing. The only border of darkness is where light touches it and extinguishes it. And so in the same way, we can hate evil, but the way that we need to respond to it is with good. Because if your love draws somebody and they even have the chance, if they even begin to come to Jesus, Jesus is the one who takes evil out of the man. And so that's why he says, pray for your enemies, do good to your enemies, show love to your enemies, because then there's hope that that evil will be taken out of the world. But if you just retaliate and get revenge, you're responding to evil with evil. You're responding to darkness with just more darkness. One of the most surefire ways that you can know that the Holy Spirit is changing you is when you begin to show love to your enemies. Me and Kelly, we've discipled quite a few people in our lives, and that's one of the quickest, that's one of the things that we go, okay, now we're seeing some progress being made. Now we can tell the Spirit's beginning to lead this person, is when we see them forgive somebody who hurt them, or we see them pray for one of their enemies. It's like there is nothing in your natural self that will make you pray for somebody who's your enemy. But if that's what's in your spirit, we know the Holy Spirit is working powerfully inside of you. And so Jesus speaks these words about loving your enemies and all of these things, and he speaks these words to the disciples, and for the next 3 years, he has to live them. He has to spend every single day, he wakes up with Judas there in his little tribe of 12 people, and he lives next to the man who's going to kill him. And for the next 3 years, Jesus says nothing as Judas steals money from him and from the other disciples, as Judas steals money from the poor. And as Judas becomes increasingly bitter and angry with God and with Jesus, Jesus still loves him exactly the same as he does to any of the others. One of the things that's so remarkable to me about that John passage that we read is it says that when Jesus says one of them is going to betray him, all of the disciples are like bewildered, and they're like, who's it going to be? Like nobody has any idea who it could be. And the reason is Jesus treated Judas no different than he treated any of the other disciples. You know, nobody looked and said, oh, well, obviously it's going to be Judas. Jesus has always treated him differently. No, they had absolutely no idea which one of them was going to be the traitor. And the reason is Jesus loved Judas so well that they had no idea. He treated even his enemy with the exact same love he did his best friends. So now I want you to fast forward again, 3 years now again into the future, back to that moment where we paused, where Jesus and Judas are both reaching across the table with that piece of bread in their hands. And we're going to pick up that story in John chapter 13, verse 27 through 20. So we pick up right where we left off, and it says, "As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, 'What you're about to do quickly.' But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival, or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night." So he takes the bread, he gets up from the table, and walks out the door, and he begins into those dusty, dirt-covered streets that we just talked about, on a path that's going to put Jesus in the tomb. And as he walks away from Jesus, his feet still wet from the water where Jesus had just finished cleansing him, cleaning his feet. He had just washed Jesus' feet, and he takes these steps and he's walking away from Jesus. And I just see in my mind his feet growing dirtier and muddier with every step that he takes away from him. And the passage ends here by saying, "And it was night." He had left the presence of the light. But we know that the next morning, the sun rose over Israel, and the Father caused its light to fall upon both the good as well as the evil. Jesus, in his perfection, the next morning he hung from a cross as the light of the Father's Son fell on him. And Jesus was there praying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing," as he hung dying. And on that same morning, on the other side of the city, Judas is distraught over what he's done. And he's maybe not even aware, but he feels the warmth of that same sun as the Father pours out his kindness on both men, on both his Son and his enemy, on both the good and the evil, on the righteous and the unrighteous. Even on the worst day in all of history, the Lord was actively loving his enemies. And as I read this passage, I just felt there is no better image in my mind of loving your enemies than how Jesus treated Judas with patience and with love, even knowing all he was going to do. And while my spirit kind of rails against the image of Jesus washing Judas's feet on that final night, there's also this beauty in it as I see the King of Kings, the Son of God, humbling himself and showing love even to a man who's going to have him killed. And if this is what God would do for us, if this is the character of Jesus who we follow, then may we learn to let go of the bitterness in our hearts. May we learn to forgive those who have wronged us in a similar way. I hope that the Spirit will speak to you as you read His Word, and I hope that if there's any unforgiveness in your heart, that because of the abundance of love of Jesus, you would respond by doing the same, by forgiving those who have wronged you. As always, I would love to hear you guys' thoughts. I'd love to hear if you have any comments, leave them in the comments below. And we just really appreciate you guys watching these videos. Okay, love you guys.